Welcome, everybody. Excited to have you all here to do today's Lunch and Learn. I'm excited to see lots of new faces and also familiar faces. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary LeClue. I'm the program director of the MSW program in school social work. So I am not going to talk very much at all today because I'm going to save most of the time for our wonderful speaker, Michelle Lewis, today. But I just had a couple of brief things to tell you. So first of all, I've passed around evaluation forms for everyone. So if you can please take a minute before you leave today to just fill those out, it helps give us valuable feedback about the speaker and the seminar and any feedback you have about the Lunch and Learn just in general. And you can hand those back up. You can turn those in on your way out. Also, for those of you who are providers who would like certification for CE credit, we have certificates up here on the table. You can just grab them on your way out. That is your certification. Got education credit for being here today. So that is my piece. I want to just take a quick minute to introduce our speaker today, Michelle Lewis, who's going to be presenting on understanding the journey of grief. Really excited to have her here. So Michelle is a licensed social worker who got her MSW from WVU in 2003. Is that right? Yeah, somewhere around there, right? And she is also the director of the West Virginia Family Grief Center and owns her own practice, right? We are very, very excited to have her present on this important topic. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to her and ask her to enlighten you. Yeah.
I have an evaluation.
Yes.
All right. Let me pull this up here real quick. Start with the PowerPoint. Okay, so just kind of starting off today, we're going to talk kind of just a nice overview as far as grief. Kind of what you're getting today is actually like a 5 or 6 hour workshop, kind of pivots into an hour. So if you think about kind of it as an overview, when you talk about adults in grief, kids in grief, and really what are some of the basic things you just kind of need to understand about that kind of process or journey of grief. So kind of real quick, we're going to talk about grief in general. I'm going to focus just a little bit on adults in grief, and then some about why grief is different for children or teenagers. And then look as far as when a death happens, and how it affects the family system. Because you think about just in general, how much like one person, someone can relate to the family can affect the whole family. And how in grief, what happens with that. I will say kind of, we're going to touch just real quick on how complicated grief is different. Some of the things that can actually lead to complicated grief versus more that kind of typical grief reaction you would see. We're not going to talk a lot about complicated grief. It's a whole kind of other topic. So kind of for today, what we're really talking about is just that kind of general kind of grief that you would normally see for people when there's not a lot of complicating factors that go with it. So when you start off, kind of that idea of what is grief. I mean, I think first of all, it's just important to kind of acknowledge that grief can happen from any change in life. Anytime something ends, or there's some type of unattachment from something, there can be a grief reaction. For today specifically, obviously, we're going to talk about death and grief that comes from when there's a death. So I wanted to start off, and unshare this, with kind of giving you a demonstration about, is that right? Okay. Giving you a demonstration to kind of talk about, when we're talking about grief, when I'm talking about grief, what does that kind of mean? What does that journey of grief look like? So, start off. So this is my life, right? You may see my back stuff, but if this is my life, and I have everything in my life, every piece of my life, exactly the way I want it. And it may look like a mess to you, but I like this. But then one day, you die. And that's what happens in my life. And I sit here, and I look around, and all I can see is chaos. All I can see is a mess. And it just looks so overwhelming. But with time, find a way to come down here and just be around all the pieces of my life. And start to look pick up. Some of these pieces, I can find a way to put back in my life pretty quick. Like eating, maybe going back to work. Some of these pieces, trust. I'm not ready for that yet. Love. I just have to place back in my box. And people come around and they want to know what they can do to help. And they want to pick up all of my pieces for me. But they can't. Because they don't know where those go in my box. They don't even know if they go in my box anymore. But they hate watching me down here around us. So when people ask, what can they do to help? The best thing that they can do, hold my hand as I sit down here going through the pieces of my life. Other than that, there's dominoes all over the floor. When you think about grief and that process, that journey of grief, what we're talking about is that process of picking up the dominoes. And we kind of tend to have this idea that we can sit down, pick up all the dominoes, throw them back in our box, and kind of move back on with life. But people tend to give us that idea. It just doesn't work because it doesn't fit right if you just try to throw it all back in. And so as we go along talking about some of the things that come up, some of the thoughts that come up with grief, it really is about that idea of picking up the pieces. I also have the question, how many of you, just show of hands, had the urge to pick up the dominoes when they fell? And you're all helpers, of course you did. And I think typically when it comes to grief, that's what we want to do. How can we help you pick up the pieces as quick as possible? Like, how can I help you feel better? And the truth is, you really can't. With grief, really one of the things that you can do is companion, right? Holding someone's hand while they start to work through that process. I think in some ways, that's one of the hardest things as helping professionals that we have to do is just be there, be present with the person. What I often find with just, again, grief counseling in general is it's a lot of just being able to hold that space for that person to start to be able to kind of talk and work through and share memories and, not try to fix or solve anything. I wanted to give you one other kind of example of what kind of, when we're talking about grief, what are we talking about? Specifically, so there's a professor at Hood University, Terry Martin, and this is actually his, this is not mine, but he had gone to talk to a second grade class when their teacher had suddenly died. And he had to kind of explain to them the idea of grief. And so this is what he had come up with. All right. He said, one day, there was me. And I was happy. And then I met you. And as we got to know each other, we became friends. And you became a part of me and a part of my life. But then one day, you died. And it felt like a part of me was missing. And I didn't know how I was going to go on. But as time's gone on, and there's been more time through my life, I realized that I can be happy again. And I can be whole again. But there is always going to be a scar where you used to be. And the reason I share this with you, and the reason I like it, is because of that idea of the scar. Often we kind of talk about people about that idea, we'll get closure, kind of get over it. And the thing is, the people that are important to us in our life, we don't just get over. They still impact our life years and years and years after they die. And so that idea of the scar really gives people permission to hold on to that person, but in a different and new way. And when we talk just a little bit as far as some of the kind of theories about grief right now, that scar really represents that fact that we don't just move past the relationship with the person, we have to change how we have a relationship with that person. So, back to that. So, when you think about the other kind of that idea of when you're looking at someone that's grieving, what do you see? What does that process look like? And so there's a model of grief that was done by Maggie Strobe that came out several years ago, probably 12 years ago now. But it's that idea of the oscillation of grief. What you guys do not have in your packets is what a model actually looks like here. But the slide you have is a good representation of it. But basically, what it's saying is that on the one side, on that restoration-oriented side, is when those ideas of getting back to life. What new skills do you have to learn? Have you ever, do you know how to write a check? Do you know what your bills are? Do you know how to drive? What are the things that maybe that other person needs to do that now you have to learn to do? Going back to work, doing new things. Those are all those kind of life-oriented things that have to happen. On the other side, the loss-oriented, you have that idea of grief work, of feeling it, of working through what the grief means to you, what those emotions mean to you, avoiding the different things that are changing in life because of the death. And what that journey of grief really looks like is being on the restoration-oriented side sometimes, and then moving over to that loss-oriented side sometimes, and then moving back over to that restoration-oriented side. And I think what's really important to know about that is that as long as there is any movement between the two sides, that is healthy grief. Maybe somebody can only touch into that restoration-oriented side real quick, right? But then they're back into that emotion and just all of the grief work. That's okay. And then you have some people that want to avoid the grief work as much as possible and just want to kind of get back to life, but they pop over here real quick. They sit down in those dominoes real quick. That's normal, healthy grief. When it starts to kind of become more of a pattern of unhealthy grieving is the person that only stays in that loss-oriented side, that they don't get kind of any ways to kind of step back into life after a period of time. Or they don't want to do the grief work at all. They don't even want to look at those emotions. There's kind of this huge wall between the two. And both of those can start a pattern towards more unhealthy or complicated grief. When you think about kids, one of the things that's important to understand with kids in this model is that kids a lot of times spend a very short amount of time in the loss-oriented side. Because one, those are really big emotions, right? And as adults, we have enough trouble sitting with big emotion and just being present with that emotion. That's even harder for most kids. And so kids will spend a lot of time over in that restoration-oriented side, going to school. We have a lot of times kids will want to go right back to school. We have parents call the grief center all the time. I'm like, you know what? Mom died 2 weeks ago, but actually I think they're doing okay. They don't really seem to be grieving. I think they're over it. They're not over it. It's just that one, often what we find is our kids tend to hide their grief from their parents, especially if it's been a parent that died. And two, this is just really, really hard. And so most kids will step into this real quick at night, right before they go to sleep, maybe quickly at school. They'll hide it in the bathroom, and so parents don't see this. But it doesn't mean it's not happening. I think that's just really important to understand when it comes to kids. You might not see the loss-oriented part, and often as well, that it's not that they're not grieving. It's just that they spend a lot more time on the other side. So kind of also with younger kids, there's a failure to realize that the loss is permanent. We're going to talk a little bit as far as age. When can kids start to really understand the permanency of death and understand actually what death fully means? Again, we talked about as far as the defense of being overwhelmed and just a short attention span. Kids can't sit looking at that too long. When you think about as far as theories of grief, a lot of times that I know when I kind of went through school, I think often still in school, in just media and movies, we often talk about those 5 stages of grief, Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief. And what we've a lot of people kind of currently think she was probably misunderstood when it kind of got into stages, the idea that first you do denial, and after you're done with denial, you move to anger. And when you're done with anger, you move to bargaining, and then depression, and then you accept it, and it's over. And what we know is grief really doesn't happen like that. It doesn't happen in these stages. Really, if nothing else, there's a whole lot more of the idea of fluidity of phases. So, all 5 of these are very kind of definitely occur within the grieving process. But you might one day kind of be in that kind of space of denial, and the next thing bargaining, and then kind of accept it, and then you wake up the next morning, you're angry again. It's just kind of this fluid process back and forth. So anymore, when it comes to grief, we really talk more about kind of stages of grief. And even, again, there's fluidity between the stages of grief. So what you'll find is there's several different scholars that have a couple of theories on when it comes to grief. They're all rather similar. I like William Worden's. The first one, just that idea of to accept the reality of the loss, to accept that that person is no longer there. And when we talk about that restoration work, what are all the things now that you have to do that you didn't have to do before because that person's not there? That's part of accepting the reality. You know, if you work and your kids have to get off the school bus at 3 o'clock and your husband just died, who's going to get the kids? That's a part of accepting the reality of that loss because that person that used to do it's not there. To experience the pain or emotional aspects of the loss, again, that idea that over here in this loss work, that part of grief is feeling the grief, feeling the anger or the sadness or the guilt or any of the multitude of emotions that can go along with grief. And, you know, I think in a lot of ways, just as people, we're not always so good with sitting with emotions. And we do a lot of things to try to avoid that, whether that's radio or media, staying busy. And so I think that second one is a really hard thing to do. To adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing, again, what does life look like now? What has to change? We're not going to talk really about a lot of times when it comes to secondary losses today, but there are many times when there's been a death and then there's something you have to move. Maybe you move to be closer to support. Maybe you have to sell the house. There's all sorts of things that can change as those secondary losses after a death occurs. And then to relocate the person that died within life and find ways to memorialize. That's a scar, right? How do you still find ways to hold that person close? How do you still find ways to connect with that person? When you think about how many people still carry on conversations with a person that died all the time, they're not crazy, right? They're connecting with that person. If you used to always turn to your dad for support and he died and now you're going through a really hard time, what's wrong with saying, hey, Dad, I don't know what to do. How do I handle this? Because you're still looking for that connection, but you're having to do it in a different way. So when you think about adults, kids, what do all grievers do? Well, as helping professionals, how do we help grievers? And so the first thing is just to normalize. I can't tell you how many clients I've had come in, and one of the first things they want to know is, am I doing this right? And so what I often tell them, there is no doing it right. They really kind of the biggest question is it healthy? So the example being, if you have a mother who has 3 other kids at home, and every single day she's going to the graveyard. And she's going to the graveyard and she's staying at the graveyard and she's forgetting to feed her kids, she's forgetting to pick up her kids, she's forgetting to do all those other things in life that have to happen. That's probably what kind of going towards that unhealthy section, right? That's not necessarily when people are asked about doing this right. But that mother that goes to the graveyard every single day, but she's also making sure that some of those responsibilities are either taken care of by her or she just makes sure somebody else is taking care of those responsibilities, that's okay. Some people need to go to the graveyard. Some people that doesn't work for them at all. But as far as that idea of normalizing, just letting people know, most of the time, the things that they're doing, as long as it's not hurting them or somebody else, is okay. And then a lot of times people just need a lot of kind of reassurance of that. To educate. Grievers need to be offered information, whether about the process of grief. You know, if somebody doesn't know that you can feel better, and then one of those huge grief waves or I like to call them grief slap in the faces happen, suddenly they think that like something horrible's happened because, wait, I was feeling good. Why am I not feeling okay? Like, what just happened? And the truth is, again, it's not stages, right? It's a process. So you can have a couple good days, and then something happens, an anniversary date comes up, and it sends you back four steps. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's normal. But people need to know that. As far as education too, a lot of times when clients come in and talk to me, one of the first things I tell them is 2 things as far as safety. So where do you think the 2 places that people cry the most are? Ideas? In bed. So in bed, but I think that's probably number 3. So when you think about just for yourself, first place is typically the car. So when you are in that, you think about being in that car, right? People feel secluded, they feel isolated away from everybody else. Typically you have the radio on, and music just has this way of sparking things anyway. And so often people will get triggered or start to cry in the car, which is fine. But if you're driving down 79 at 70 miles an hour, it's probably not okay to be sobbing as you go. So just letting people know, hey, this a lot of times happens, and when it does, pull over. Give yourself a minute. It's okay to feel it. You don't have to stop it, but keep yourself safe and pull over. Because there's a lot of times people are driving down the road, and they're just not even physically present because the emotions have taken over. Second place is in the shower. You know, again, it's kind of the idea of that confined space. People feel just feel a little bit more, where they can kind of express themselves more. And you're already wet, so why not? But you do find people cry a lot in the shower, in the car. I'm sure people cry a lot in the bed too. But giving that little bit of education, of just that reminder, like, hey, pull over. The other thing to think about when it comes to educating clients is we're going to talk about some of the specific things that you can see in grief, but poor concentration, poor attention span, clumsiness are all three things that tend to go with grief. And so when you look at, there was a study done, and I can't quote you the study, but it was within 18 months of a death, 80% of people will experience either an accident or a serious illness. And when you think about the fact that people aren't focusing as much, they're not able to concentrate as much, they are crying while driving down the road, they're not really kind of fully physically there when they're doing things, it makes sense that people are more likely to get hurt. And so letting people know that also, hey, you know, it's going to be harder to focus. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Make sure you're eating. Make sure that, you know, you're doing things that are important. I had a client who had a spouse die, and they left the door open to the basement one night, all night long. And this is an older person. And the next morning they woke up and they were completely freaked out because it just from a standpoint of safety. At first it was like, how could I have left that door? Our focus and concentration isn't as good. And so do those things of what can you do to keep yourself safe? Even helping people brainstorm that a little bit. Physically safe in your environment, within yourself, all these things. Affirm, just reminding people that they do have strengths. You know, that they have ways to cope that worked before, and they can still work now, that they can get through this. And then companion. You know, as far as with the dominoes and that kind of idea of like, you know, just holding somebody's hand. How do you companion with a person as they go through that journey? And the first part is really just meeting them where they are and being able to just kind of go through that process with them, not minimizing any of their experiences. So as far as adults go, when you think about kind of some of the grief reactions you see, emotionally, and a lot of these make a lot of sense, I'm not going to go through all of them, but difficulty in relationships. And we're going to talk a little bit family systems at the end, but when you think about if you are preoccupied in your own pain, it's really hard to connect with the other people in your life, with other family members, with friends, and so you start to you can have difficulty in relationships. People start feeling, you know, a lot of times either like someone's not there enough for them, in a lot of different ways. Often what you'll hear is for the first 6 weeks or so, there's a lot of support. There's a lot of people there who are there to help. And then that starts to trickle off, and everyone else goes back to their life. And now here you are with this whole different life, and that starts to kind of bring up those difficulties in relationships too. So even preparing some people or after that, all that kind of initial support's gone, then, and that's actually when I see a lot of people come into counseling, is right around that six weeks, 2 month period of time after the death has occurred, because that's when the support starts to go away. Guilt, you know, when you think about how quickly we all go to the shoulda, coulda, wouldas, you know, I should have done this, if only I could have done this, I would have done this if I only would have known, I can't believe I said that. Guilt, I think, is one of those things that comes up a lot with grief. And, you know, with kids, you see it more in the idea of magical thinking. They actually believe the shoulda, coulda, wouldas. With adults, we kind of know that maybe I couldn't have done that, but there's still that part that's just like, I should have known that he had cancer and he was going to die. I should have known I needed to do this. And so then that guilt starts to come up. And guilt can block that grieving process. When you talk about one of those things that quickly can start to block that journey, is because typically if we're walking towards grief, right, or we're walking kind of that grief journey, and you hit that barrier of guilt, what do most people do when that guilt and shame starts to come up? Not going there, right? Let me walk away from that as quick as possible. And so now that journey gets halted for a little bit. So that guilt becomes really important to kind of talk about, to work through, and it's also really hard to talk about. Physical, talked a little bit again, more likely to be alcohol prone. If you're working or you know someone that's grieving and they have a history of having an alcohol or drug problem and they have found sobriety, it's a time where even if they've been away from whatever their supports were, AA and NA, whatever it's been, it's really a time that they need to go back to those supports. It's a time where relapse becomes a huge potential. And so if there's been kind of a history of that before, going back to those supports becomes really important. For someone that hasn't had a history of alcohol or drug use, again, it also can be a coping mechanism that people turn to. And so being that idea of educating, being able to talk to people about it, it can be easy to turn to alcohol. Maybe you don't need to drink, those 4 glasses of wine at night so that you can sleep, so that you don't feel everything. And being able to talk about some of those dangers as well. Headaches and migraines become common. When we are stressed, and grief can cause that stress, what do? You tense up, right? You tense your body, you tense your shoulders, it tenses all the neck muscles, and headaches become pretty common. You're overwhelmed, you're emotionally overwhelmed, headaches become pretty common. And then just trouble sleeping. For those people over here in this restoration part, right? Maybe they go all day long. They're working, they're taking care of the kids, whatever else, and they're getting by. And then they go to lay down at night, and all those things they weren't able to kind of look at and focus on or feel during the day come flooding back. And now they can't fall asleep because their mind won't stop. And so being able to kind of talk about sleep. Sleep is one of the most important things that we do as far as how we can get through the day. So when you start to get in this pattern of not being able to sleep at night or waking up all night, and then you have to kind of make it through your day, and it's already a more stressful day because it's just the grieving process, you have to be able to find ways to help people get sleep or referring out to help people get sleep, because sleep becomes really, really important. Plus, we know that when people stop sleeping or not getting the sleep that they need, serotonin levels start to drop too, so people become more likely then to develop depression as well. And so sleep becomes really important. Intellectually, again, problems concentrating, becoming just more forgetful. I can't tell you how many people will say some type of story of like, I went to go open my refrigerator and my remote control was in the refrigerator, like I'm losing my mind. That's where that educating plays, or not even normalizing. You're not losing your mind. You're not focusing. You're not really being able to kind of engage with what's going on around you, but you're not losing your mind. I'll have people a lot of times say, I think maybe I'm starting to develop Alzheimer's. No, it is the grief. People are really, really worried. Again, they can go and have an evaluation done. But if it wasn't there before and suddenly it's there, and it's one of those things often, it's the grief. And then lack of attention to detail. One of the things that happens too when you think about all of these different symptoms is how people start to get affected at work. That often work performance goes down. We often are given 3 days maybe from work as leave. And so people aren't doing as well at work, they're not performing as well as work. And some people have jobs that can tolerate that, and a lot of people don't. And so being able to even help figure out how to work with that employer to understand what's going on a little bit, how can that person kind of be able to communicate with their employer so that the job doesn't become in jeopardy, and that's one more thing on top. So moving on just a little to kids. I'm going to spend a little bit more time with kids because
Hello.
Grief, but you feel like some of these things are the same if they're grieving like death, like maybe like someone like a breakup or just something that causes it to, even if it's not like the person actually dying.
I think some of them absolutely apply. I think some of the things that have more to do with like where there's that permanency part. So some of that may be a little bit different. Problems concentrating, focusing, having to figure out how to live life now that that person's not there. Sometimes like when you think about it from a breakup standpoint, there's a choice there, right? Sometimes with death, there's not a choice. With breakups, there is. That part makes sometimes that even harder. So, absolutely. Some of the things are very similar, and then there's going to be some differences also. All right, we good?
Yes, I think we're good.
So as far again, we're talking about those younger kids just thinking that needing to understand that death is permanent. That when somebody dies, they can't come back. And we're going to talk in here in a minute about some of the ways we talk about death with kids. And then from that kind of middle childhood, 7-ish, 11, 12, kind of before those teen years, again, they become a little bit less ego-centered. They kind of have more of that empathy, kind of understanding more, kind of maybe the emotions their parents are experiencing are separate than their own. But they're very bound with concrete. This age group is very black or white in their thinking. And that becomes really important also when we think about how we talk about death. And again, as far as that idea of basically understanding that they have the ability to understand that death is permanent. They understand that people don't come back after they die. So with those younger kids, what do they need to understand the permanency of death? I'm going to go through these real quick. Just that idea of like basically universality, that everything will eventually die, that every living thing will die. Your fish will eventually die, that a human being will eventually die, that everything will eventually die. What's hard about that, though, too, is when a child can understand that. So if you have a child that's had a parent die, let's say dad died, and they start to get to that space where they understand that everything that's alive will eventually die, that's when you're going to get the question to mom then of, wait, does that mean you're going to die? Right? And the answer is, yeah, at some point. But so once you have a child that's concepts, that brings on a whole nother layer also, because now they've lost one parent and they start to understand it's possible to lose another parent. And you'll start to see kids that understand this concept. A lot of times might have a lot of separation anxiety or a lot of controlling behaviors. I had a client whose father had completed suicide, and she would question her mom, where are you going? When will you be back? Don't you dare have that beer to drink. I mean, just on and on and on, because she was afraid about her mom's safety, because she was afraid her mom would. And so when you think about kind of some of the things you start to see, because there's a fear, because now they understand that kind of that everything will die. Again, the irreversibility, that once something's living has died, it can't come back. So when you think about talking, how do we explain death to a child, especially that doesn't fully understand this? It's a lot of times we want to talk about it, touches it on here, it's non-functionality, that our body dies, right? So we talk about death, the language we use to talk about, they passed away, they've moved on, they went to sleep. We talk about death in all of these kind of lighter terms, but when we talk about those kids needing very concrete things to understand that, all the ways that as adults we typically talk about death really doesn't work for kids. It sends a lot of mixed messages. We lost him. Well, to a kid, what does it mean if you say that we lost your dad, right? Go find him. Like, what do you mean you lost him? So talking about death and explaining death from a body standpoint. You know, when we die, our lungs stop breathing, our heart stops beating, and when our lungs can't breathe air and our heart can't beat, our body dies. You know, and being able to understand it from a very biological standpoint. As far as this last part on here, you know, as far as what happens kind of after the body dies, and kids will ask questions about, okay, so their body died, where are they? Or, you know, from a religious standpoint, you know, where is their soul or whatever else? And those become kind of very individual questions and questions kind of that kind of from that framework what happens, works for the family. But kids will have questions, but also being very careful of how we answer those questions. Because we had a kid at the Grief Center many years ago that they told him that his dad would be looking down on him from heaven. And so this kid was having nightmares and nightmares and nightmares and nightmares. And what it really, and finally after kind of talking more, he said, why did they chop off Dad's head? Right? Because if Dad is up in heaven looking down on me, but I saw them put his body in the grave, and I know his body's in there, then how can he be in heaven looking down on me unless they chop his head off? Right? So when you think about how the things that we say and how kids interpret them becomes really important just to think about. So then, what are some of the things you see with kids? A lot of these are going to be similar to with us with adults, but there's a couple that are different that are important to look at. Regressed or immature reactions. So a child that's been potty trained, you know, a younger child that's been potty trained now suddenly isn't potty trained. A child that has been sleeping in their bed for years alone now suddenly wants to get back into bed with the parents. Just different types of kind of where there's a lot of regression in behavior. You see those children that are overly mature. So when mom dies and that child that now is going to step in and take on everything mom used to do, they're going to take care of their siblings, they're going to make the lunches, they're going to do all of those things. You know, we have a habit a lot of times of telling little boys, well, you're the man of the house now, right? What type of pressure does that put on a 7-year-old to tell them that they're now the man of the house? And also, what does that do to this family dynamic when you have a 7-year-old that's being told they're not the man? Again, aggression, often that kind of anger that will come out kind of through behaviors. Hyperactivity is an important one to think of because a lot of times you'll have a kid that's grieving or struggling with something. And again, you have this big emotion, right? You got this little bit of a body. And so that emotion has to come out somehow. And so you start to see all this hyperactivity, this movement, this fidgeting that isn't ADHD. It's just really big emotions this kid doesn't know what to do with. And so being able to really understand, you know, the history of what is this kid struggling with right now. Because sometimes it might be ADHD, but there's a lot of times it's just really big emotions this kid's struggling with. Perfectionism, wanting to do everything perfect so that nothing else bad will happen. And you'll see kids reenact death through play, through artwork. There's a little boy a long time ago who his father had died in a car accident. So every time he'd come to the grief center, he would pick up 2 trucks and he would just smash them together over and over and over. His dad had driven a truck. But again, if a child doesn't have an idea of what happened, he just knows kind of what they heard, well, and try to understand, what does that look like? What happened? What happens when I smash 2 trucks together? You'll see that child in art in different kind of creative ways replay that over and over and over, trying to understand it. And then the emotions, again, you'll find a lot of times are pretty similar with adults. That self-blaming kind of goes along with that guilt. Kids are a lot more likely to blame themselves and not share it. Anxieties, kids that suddenly, you know, have been great sleepers are suddenly not sleeping. Being really hesitant to separate from that parent. So you'll find some kids that school is like the way away from the grief, right? But you'll find other kids that school brings up so much anxiety because they have to separate from the remaining parent. And that idea of, you know, what if I leave and something happens to them too? And then those physical reactions. Again, our emotions, you know, we feel them in our bodies, we experience them all over. So stomach aches. You'll find kids often carry so much, we all do, but carry so much of their emotions in their belly. And so kids are constantly kind of complaining of stomach aches. Headaches, overeating, undereating, kind of increased illnesses, all of those things start to be really common. I was giving this workshop a long time ago, and lady shared that was in the audience, and she had a son die from a brain tumor. And she shared that suddenly her other son started having a lot of headaches, and headaches all the time. And this woman was very in tune and said she was a social worker. And finally she went to her younger son and she said, "Are you worried you have a brain tumor?" He said, "Yes, I know I'm going to die just like my brother did." And she was like, "Okay, let's go get you an MRI." And he didn't have a brain tumor, and she was pretty sure he didn't have a brain tumor. And not everyone has the ability to go and pay out of pocket to have an MRI done to reassure a kid. But when you look at, again, how often our worries, our anxieties manifest within our bodies, you know, he was so worried about having that brain tumor that his head was pounding all the time. And as soon as he knew he didn't have a brain tumor, the headaches went away. And so you just think about how much we've manifested in our bodies as well. And again, I think with kids, the thing that's important to remember is that limited ability to verbalize feelings. As adults, most of us have, happy, sad, mad, glad. We don't have a lot of vocabulary often for our emotions either. Kids have even less. So how am I supposed to explain to you how I'm feeling and all of these really mixed up thoughts and feelings I have going on if I don't even know how to discuss my emotions? And so helping kids have a way to kind of explain, or kind of giving them vocabulary or helping them understand vocabulary to express how they're feeling, then helps to empower them to understand what's going on for themselves. I think the other important thing that's for kids is these three things. Did I cause it to happen? Is it going to happen to me? And who's going to take care of it? So when you think about just talking to kids in general when it comes to grief, just first reassuring a child that it's not their fault. They didn't cause it. Because one, if there's a part of them that's thinking that they did, it opens up that ability for communication about it. You're kind of addressing it to start with. That is it going to happen to me? So if I've learned that everything dies, now I'm also going to have a question about, will I die? And so being able to talk about those things. And then who's going to take care of me? Again, kids tend to be a little egocentric. So, well, mom, so dad died, and now if you die, what happens to me? Often at the Grief Center, when it's been a parent that died and the other parent comes in, we'll talk about, do you have a will made up? Do you have someone appointed as guardian for your child if you can't for whatever reason, or if you do die? And why is that's important for a lot of reasons, but from a kind of standpoint for kids, it's important because it provides security. Being able to say, I do lots of things to take care of myself, right? I wear my seatbelt, I eat healthy, I do everything to take care of myself so that I can be here to take care of you. But if something happens to me, this is who's going to take care of you. And that provides security for a child. And so, because by addressing the fact that, yes, it's possible you might die, you're not suddenly giving them this new information if they understand that every living thing dies. They're worrying about that anyway. So you're just putting it out there to actually talk about and then provide them safety. And then it kind of also goes, what does the child need to know? What does the child want to know? And what can the child understand? I think this comes up a lot of times, especially when there has been a suicide that occurs, if there's been a homicide that occurs, because a lot of times parents will call and say, what do I tell my child about this? How do I explain that? And so I always kind of refer back to those three questions. What do they need to know? What do they want to know? What are they asking? But also, what age are they at? What developmental level are they at? What can they actually understand if you're telling them that? Pretty much kind of talk about all these. Biggest thing I would say is being honest, honest within that realm of what can they understand. Sometimes with kids, as adults, we'll feel really uncomfortable with the things we're talking about. So we go to this very sterile, let me over-explain everything about the medical procedure and this and that and whatever else, because it feels safer than actually talking about kind of the emotional part. So being able to kind of talk to them on their own level, really just making sure that you're avoiding metaphors. We use metaphors a lot in our speech. Kids don't get our metaphors. And it's kind of again that thing of dad will be looking down on you from heaven. And kind of just keeping kind of that idea. If I explain death to a child in this way, how will it be understood? And just being able to kind of, if nothing else, keep that in mind. Where could the misunderstandings come from? And then always check back in. If you said this, this, and this in an explanation, what did you hear me say? Because often what we say to a kid isn't what they hear. And so being able to check back in with what they heard. So I think it's really important to kind of address when you think about, again, deaths that occur, that typically deaths occur in a system, right? They are something that we typically aren't just on our own. So when you think about deaths that occur within a family system, let's see real quick. Within a family system, so if this is my family, right? Families are constantly striving for some sort of balance, right? And what that balance looks like is going to be different in any family, but some type of balance. But if I go and remove one of these people from this balance, everything's changed, right? So now, mom, who used to do everything, is so overwhelmed with emotion, she can't do anything. And so child comes up to the top and is starting to run things. Or it just starts to feel like our family is just bouncing around and there's just chaos, right? So when you think about from kids, you think about for adults, how do we respond to this type of chaos going on? The other thing that often happens, and when you think about grief and how we grieve, there's kind of this idea of intuitive grievers and instrumental grievers. It was some of the work that was done by Terry Martin. But when you look at the idea of intuitive grievers are your people that emote more, right? They are more emotional with their grief. They tend to feel that emotion more, externally express that emotion more. Your instrumental grievers tend to be more of your doers of grief. So those people that are, planning the funeral, making arrangements, calling everybody, just, checking what the will is, doing just all of the acts that go along when there's been a death or grief. A friend of mine gave an example a long time ago that was wonderful, that there was this lady that had come in to see her, and her kids had said, something's wrong, you need to go talk to this lady. And her husband had died. And before he died, they had been working on redoing their house. So after he died, she one day was there and she was pulling up the floorboards and kind of taking up all the floors. And her kids were like, Mom, you've gone crazy, you gotta go see this counselor. But what she went on to talk about was that she and her husband had been planning to redo the floors. He had taught her how to use the tools. He had taught her how to pull up all the flooring, how to put down new flooring. And in doing that, and she was grieving with every board she pulled up, with every tool of his that she used to put down a new one, she's grieving. Because that's that doing of grieving. And so what happens though from that family standpoint is if you have an instrumental griever in a family, and you have more of an intuitive griever in a family, these two people don't understand each other. And so now you have this family that's grieving with people but they can't communicate about it. Because that person that's more on the instrumental side doesn't understand the emotional part. They can't be there to support that emotional person a lot of times. And the person that's more emotional is like, look, they're not even grieving. They don't even care. All they're doing is putting down new floorboards. And so now you have a lot of misunderstanding that's also happening within the family because of different grieving styles. And so part of that idea of how to educating grievers is educating that people do experience grief differently and process grief differently. And so just because your spouse is doing A, B, C, D, and E and not necessarily talking about the emotion of it doesn't mean they're not grieving. And then how do you help to recreate communication within this family system so that they each are getting their needs met, yet still grieving the way that kind of comes naturally to them. Most people aren't all the way over here on the intuitive side and all the way over here on that instrumental side. Most people are somewhere on that spectrum. They just tend to lean more towards one side or the other. So how do you find a way for both people to get their needs met and meet each other's needs within that family? Okay. A couple other things to think about, just one of the factors that kind of will affect for that grieving process. Again, was the death sudden or was it anticipated? Had there been this long drawn out terminal illness or was it a car accident? A lot of times you find those more sudden deaths, it's more likely to lead to that complicated grief. when there's been time to just have that anticipatory grief, to grieve before the person even starts to die, that grieving process can look a lot different. The age of the person that died. You know, if grandma was 90 years old, it's still hard for grandma when grandma dies because she's a part of our life. But we may see that different if grandma dies at 90 and our 4-year-old dies, because the age of the griever does, we have different experiences with that. I think one of the things that's really important, and I see a lot, is what the relationship was like with the person that died. Was the relationship really strained? Had there always been this hope that actually we would make it better at some point? You know, marriages that actually weren't in a really good place when that person died, and but we wanted to make it better, and now the chance is gone. So when there's been a strained relationship with the person that died, it is more likely to create complications in that grieving process. There's the others. You know, I think the other thing that just is important to think about, especially with kids, is that but adults as well, we will re-grieve. You know, maybe that person died 5 years ago, and now we're kind of at a different part of our life, and we really wish that person was there again. And we may grieve again the fact that they're not there. It'll be different than the first time, but we re-grieve that because now it means something different. Kids re-grieve a lot because kids just go through a whole lot more developmental process because just of their age in general. So if you lose your mom and your mom dies when you are 6, that means something very different when you are 13, and something different when you're 18, and something different if you get married and then your first child. And every step of those developmental milestones, you will re-grieve that fact that she's not there. So as adults, we do it too, just not as much because we don't hit some of those developmental milestones as much. But when you think about, the 50-year-old widow who becomes a grandmother, now she's grieving again because that partner's not there to now experience that. So adults will re-grieve as well. Again, as far as just some of the other things that may lead to that traumatic or complicated grief, the relationship history, any attachment concerns. Again, just from an attachment standpoint, real quick, if you have someone that tends to have a just more anxious attachment anyway, and then that person of their attachment has died, that can lead to a lot of more complicated grieving. And I think what's important is often kids don't necessarily need referrals for counseling when someone dies, if they have people in their life that can provide that support, and if they know that they're not the only one this has ever happened to. Peer support's really important for kids. Having that support of people their own age. They don't necessarily need counseling, but there are times when counseling becomes important also. And then the last thing is just an idea of linking objects. So when we talk about that scar from the beginning, that linking objects are those things that let us continue our relationships with people in a different way. I normally wear, and I don't have it on today, but I have a necklace that was my grandmother's, and I pretty much wear it all the time. And it's one of those things that, like, just randomly throughout my day, if I reached up and grabbed hold of my necklace, I think of her. It's a way to connect to her, right? I have a hat that was my grandfather's. All those different things that we have, we hold on to, we keep, that are really important for connecting with that memory, connecting with that person that died, whether that's talking to them or pictures of them, but helping people be able to kind of identify those linking objects. Those keychains that have pictures on them. For some people, being able to have those keychains. Or our sense of smell is one of those things that trigger our emotions, one of the fastest. So when you think about that scent that person used to wear, being able to even kind of hold on to those types of things just to help make feel close to those people. Because there's some times where we really need to kind of attach to those people, and we have to do it different than when they were alive. But there's still ways to do that after they die. So that is just a saying I've liked for a long time. Basically, a child and an adult that can live through anything so long as he or she is told the truth and is allowed to share with loved ones the natural feelings people have when suffering. So, any questions at all?
I did want to ask you, have you talked a lot? I know that the 6th stage of grief that they've talked about now recently is the finding the meaning.
Right.
Isn't that, do you feel like that, because Jim and I had talked about earlier, I feel like that is a part of the grieving process that has been there all along, just not maybe labeled.
Yeah, I think it's been there for a long time. It's one of those, though, I think that someone has to be ready to get to, because if that comes up too soon, you get hit with so much anger. What do you mean there could be? It's just that you get hit with that anger. So, but when you find someone that's starting to that idea of like, what can they do to make that bigger? Right? What can they do to make meaning of that or make it important? Whether that's at a very small scale of just through themselves or on a much larger scale. I think that making that meaning becomes really important. Some people, though, take a really, really long time in their kind of journey to get to that place. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.